So how many of you have seen Ford versus Ferrari? I mean, it's a great movie. I love it because it works on so many levels. Sure, it's a story about elite car racing at Le Mans, but it's also a story about a husband and a wife. It's a story about a father and a son. It's a story about two stubborn mavericks who are trying to do the seemingly impossible. And it's also a story about corporate intrigue and politics and the dark side of marketing and its disregard of the art and passion of a truly creative endeavor. Of course, House Industries loves this movie. In many ways, the company and its founder, Andy Cruz, was born in a garage. Andy's dad is a legendary pinstriper whose love of the hot rod and the artistic flair of freehand customization found a vessel in his son that has been translated into a love of letters and numbers that is both profound and inspired. But as much as we love this movie, we had one major issue, the title. I mean, sure, Ford versus Ferrari is really clear. It tells the story of competition and revenge and Ford's punitive retribution to Ferrari for using it as bait to sell itself to Fiat. Still, as a design agency and a foundry, we thought it should be called United versus Bullet. Now, for those of you in the audience that are fluent in fonts, this will make perfect sense and it might even be funny. But for those of you who don't, I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of comedy and I'm going to explain the joke. So when Ford built the modern GT, we worked with them to apply our United font to capture the militaristic clarity and tight typography for the supercar's instrument panel and identity detailing. Now, Ferrari has long used our bullet font to present its culture of speed and curves and momentum to racing. But what can you do? I suppose Hollywood had its own ideas. Maybe, just maybe, they didn't want to pay the license, the fonts, to stay on brand. So I want to take a moment to thank all of you for tuning in today for our talks around typography and brands and style and design. I'm excited to share the bill with our other guest speakers, and I want to thank Monotype for sponsoring this virtual event in our weirdest of times. Before working with House, I admired their races crashing back here. It was a last minute arrival. The post office and UPS is having some trouble during COVID. Before working with House, I admired their style and I was intrigued by their business. And I covered them when I was a senior editor at Fast Company. We included them in our Masters of Design issue, and I wrote about how the work by House is like all good subversives. They hide in plain sight. So we even decided to collaborate, which is sort of unusual for a magazine to collaborate with your subjects, but we wanted to collaborate on the art for the spread. Now, even if you don't know House, you've seen our work. Whether it's walking the cereal aisle of the grocery store, or Jimmy Kimmel's late night show, or his comedy club, or an album cover, or a Tokyo window display. We make fonts that become the identity of the world's most interesting brands, products, and people. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. Let's take a simple word and start putting it into a variety of different faces. Helvetica, Times New Roman, Futura, Curls, Cooper Black, Brush Script. Now it's in Burbank. Look at what happens. A word magically turns into a mark that's almost impossible to see in any other way. Why is this? Well, because we believe the font makes the brand. The font is the identity that can easily move between a digital gaming space to product packaging, to a billboard, to a phone, or a watch. It can even be weaponized in the battlefield of a corporate brawl. Look at the way Epic Games took Apple's iconic 1984 spot and flipped it on its head. Look at how Burbank works as a type of resistance in Fortnite's battle for placement in the App Store. And that's just one of the remarkable things about the power of type. It can embody elements of every cultural force and help define it. So not only does a font make a brand, but we believe that a font can make a movement. Look at the way Neutra Face captures the essence of the modern quest for women's equality. It both speaks the truth and looks so cool, I want to wear it on a t-shirt. And not to be superficial, but if you're not willing to wear the identity of your company, a product or movement, or on a t-shirt, well, then you're working for the wrong company, selling the wrong product, or you're behind a movement that needs some serious style counsel. And I'm pretty sure the Chateau Marmont font is a Monotype font, but I have to double check that. But the beauty and elegance of a type like Neutra is that it can really run the full spectrum of the human cycle, from Shake Shack as a food source to Tushy as a device that cleans your backside after you process that food source. So the font can make the brand, it can make a movement, it can also make a product. So we've been working with Design Within Reach for a long time, and we share a love for mid-century modern masters and living with pieces in our home that seamlessly blends form and function. We're especially proud of our collaboration on house numbers. That takes the clean style of the desert master architect Richard Neutra's numbering and naming letters, and we turn them into DWR's best-selling product. Or the house numbers and clocks that we've made with ceramics. Or a crystal collection that we did with Baccarat. Or when the most respected publication in media trusted us to design a new font identity based on its typographic legacy, when they realized that they had to adapt to a new digital reality. So if the font makes the brand and the movement and the product and the identity and defines every type of culture, from music to sport to food to subversion, then it only makes sense that fonts will make and define the global digital transformation. So now whenever I hear the words like global and digital and transformation, the Mission of Burma song runs through my mind's ear. That's when I reach for my revolver. So global digital transformation is one of those phrases that maybe Raymond Weil or Microsoft CEO came up with. It probably once sounded cool and future perfect, but now it just radiates jargon. Still, it's true, and it deserves definition because it's the reality that we're living in. So the global digital transformation is the reality that everything we read and experience as communication is becoming digital. From billboards to video games to watches to that nano chip that we're going to have installed in our brains to back up our thoughts and memories, right? And so that need to be both big and small, macro and micro, is in many ways the ideal components of what makes a font work, both technically and philosophically, right? Even Goldman Sachs has gotten in on the action with the release a few days ago of Goldman Sans. It's a font defined as neutral with a wink, which to me kind of sounds like a great description of a pickpocket. Now, a big deal was made about the fact that Goldman Sans is available to everyone for free, right? So does that mean the font and fonts in general don't have any value? I mean, one of the biggest, most powerful financial institutions in the world created a typeface and then gave it away. Actually, it says the opposite. Goldman doesn't throw away money. I mean, unless you look at the expense accounts of its bankers. No, Goldman understands the value of a type of identity. Sure, maybe somebody in their marketing department thought, hey, let's give it away and see if some cool brand or product or person uses it as their type expression. But the reality is, the value is in the fact that they have letters and numbers that attempt to define Goldman's worldview. Neutral with a wink. So it's a tall order for letters and numbers, but it's also what they're for. Obviously, as font people, we believe that letters are interesting and malleable and the building blocks of communication. But here's the rub. A letter isn't particularly interesting until it gets together with other letters and makes words and phrases and ideas that challenge people to think different. So perhaps it isn't subtle, that this talk has been influenced by film. Ford versus Ferrari, the nod to Dr. Strangelove in the title. And to talk about type and movies and not mention Helvetica, it's almost a kind of lettering blasphemy. So I recently rewatched it, and I realized that what I remembered and what the movie is actually about was kind of out of alignment in my mind. In actuality, Helvetica is this very refined and sophisticated design polemic, and it occasionally veers into like these aesthetic fisticuffs. It starts out with the great Massimo Vignelli saying, look, if I'm being generous, there are probably only a dozen good typefaces. And in reality, he only uses 3. He goes on to detail how when a dog, the word dog is placed in a kind of typeface, it doesn't have to look like a dog. He says, there are people who think that when you write dog, it should bark. He says, I don't think type should be expressive at all. Well, at House, we respectfully disagree. We believe that fonts should not only bark, they should bite, they should growl, they should snuggle, and they should certainly be loyal to their owner. I mean, look at the way Burbank barks. And I bet if you ask Apple, they might say that it bites too. So of course, we get it. Helvetica is a great way. It's great the way that one of your favorite songs is great. But how many times can you see it? How many times can you hear it before you start getting blind to it and want to play something new, imagine something new? At House, we believe that a font in the hands of a designer can be like a tattoo needle that inks an idea into your brain, gives it ownership, and makes you see something in a way that can't be unseen. Of course, a classic example is how the E and the X in Futura Bold places a negative space arrow in the FedEx logo, suggesting both forward momentum and direction and efficiency. So when I told a friend of mine the title of my talk today, he said something dismissive like, that's just a little too cute. And I almost changed it. I mean, except of course that we'd sent out all these invitations and notices and gifts and social media and the full omnicom of tell everybody everything, right? But, besides the minor inconvenience of asking Monotype and Andy and all the other parts of this machine that puts on an event like this, hey, I think I need to change the title, right? I decided to just take a breath and think about why I'd originally come up with it. Now, obviously, there's a firm tongue planted in cheek to compare the global digital transformation and compare it to the threat of the Cold War, global nuclear annihilation. But the comparison dials into a deeper parallel of the human condition. Sometimes the only answer to massive change and what might feel like a deep existential threat is the only thing that can disarm the paralyzing fear of embracing change, and that is love. The global digital transformation is not only coming, it is here. Despite moves towards isolationism, a retreat from globalism, the present and the future of business and design and communication is global. And to do anything but love that is not only counterproductive, it's futile. And this idea of fighting, or even worse, ignoring the inevitable force of change, reminded me about a story from House's own narrative and origin story. It's a cautionary tale, if you will. So House Industries, we believe in embracing our heroes, and sometimes they're people, and sometimes they are the perfection that is the Eames lounge chair, or it's the space-age offset body of a Fender jazz master, or the drawing of the late Cramp singer, Lux Interior. We respect and challenge, and we collaborate with our heroes. We wrote an entire chapter of our book, The Process is the Inspiration, on the idea of working with like-minded conspirators. So in 2002, House developed a close relationship with photo lettering. We asked the legendary type designer, Ed Benguet, if we could create a set of fonts based on photo lettering alphabets that had never been digitized.
I'm Ed Benguet. I designed Montage in the 1960s for Photo Lettering Incorporated. It was used for book covers, albums, you name it. Aretha, Valley of the Dolls, Where No Man Has Gone Before, and even Mechanical Zen. The original forms have been remastered by House Industries, and they've been tested on a bunch of house bullshit. And now Montage can be yours. Benguet Montage, from House Industries.
So as photo lettering's art director from the late 50s to the early 90s, Ed played a major role in the company's colorful history. In short, photo lettering's body of work represents a quintessential visual history of 20th century American advertising and design. Even still, photo lettering closed its doors in the mid-90s, failing to keep up with the digital publishing revolution. And it left some of the most illustrative displays of typography to gather dust and slowly decompose. In early 2003, we received a call from Bob Rose, one of photo lettering's last owners. He wanted to know if we were interested in purchasing the company's remaining assets. The house crew immediately headed to New York, and the next day we had a meeting at the Chelsea Piers Manhattan mini storage, where they had stored the rest of the photo lettering archive. So the unit contained over 10,000 film negatives and dozens of extremely rare and fragile glass plates, in which the early photo lettering alphabets were exposed. So we purchased it on the spot and moved it back to a climate-controlled facility in our home state of Delaware. I live in New York. Photo lettering then became a partnership, and we set about carefully selecting, digitizing, and enhancing some of our favorite photo lettering alphabets using an ingenious letter setter system that digitally approximated photo lettering's original process. To make the unique alphabets accessible to a wider audience of creatives, we remastered our digital photo lettering alphabets, and we offer them as a conventional desktop and web fonts on our website, long before the coinage of the global digital transformation. So now trying to predict the future or even like reimagine it is a bit of a Twilight Zone episode. But had we not rescued this arc of type from the storage facility, we might not have the classic marks and logos that are sprinkled throughout popular culture. One of the first uses was the Kate Moss line from Topshop. So the relationship with photo lettering also became a divining rod for how we develop our fonts and what we believe that they are capable of. And we believe in the power of type to be a force across culture. We believe that type has an infinite capacity for creativity. How the Ratfink font can effortlessly represent both Beatnik Bandit and Animal Crossing. But what we really believe is that you don't have to fear or resist or ignore the transformation. After all, it's just zeros and ones. And what you need to remember is why you became a designer and fell in love with art in the first place. The quest for something new, the quest to arrest an audience and make them think. Now, I've always loved words, and in particular, being able to find words inside other words or phrases. And as I was thinking about the word to leave you with, to inspire you to move forward in these most tumultuous and uncertain times, I just looked inside the title of today's talk and I found it. Stop worrying and love. And remember, whatever you do it in a type of style.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a fantastic presentation. I just want to remind everyone that you can go ahead and submit questions through their Zoom webinar chat. So we'll be looking for those to come through. I think there are a few, Mark, that came through already. So let me just start with one, if you're ready, from Jennifer Wu. So she was asking, is it better to have one brand typeface across all mediums or to have one or two, depending on print or web?
Well, I think that you need to have fonts that get along together, and you want to have a font that represents the way that your brand projects itself to the world. So you can definitely have more than one font. The New York Times uses several different fonts. As a font foundry and as a representative of the font industry, license and buy as many fonts as you need to, but make sure, right, that you dial into what your brand represents and the mood and the attitude and the purpose of what your company wants to be and wants to do, and make sure that your visual identity reflects that.
So another question is just about creative collaboration, Mark, and obviously, at House, you're a team of creatives. And so how has your team adapted to creative collaboration over the past 5.5 months or so?
Well, I mean, we're a little old school, we started as a company that made like print catalogs, and so it's not unusual for me to pick up the phone and actually talk to Andy on it, or to talk to Ken. And oftentimes when Ken and Andy are working together to develop a script or develop what you saw in that Typography, the vellum, that's Ken with his favorite pencil, working on paper. So while the kind of cluster flip of everything that's happening right now has definitely separated us, we use technology to communicate, and it certainly makes it easier to be in person, because the back and forth in distance, it just kind of sucks, I think, But that said, we kind of live on this edge of the analog and the digital, and so we're not afraid to use whatever tools possible to work together with our collaborators, because we have an art factory in Michigan. We have friends in Los Angeles. We have friends in Austin. We have friends in North Dakota. We have friends, in Louisiana, and we're just sending all of our love out there just to hope they get through this kind of awful storm and what's happening down there. So, it's an adjustment and it's an evolution, but we like being in the same room because, Andy is very good at doing these little chiropractic adjustments. It's sort of like, if you ever taken a yoga class and then the teacher comes over to you and moves you a millimeter and your whole body just goes, whoa, and you just find that, and you're like, damn, I didn't know I was even out of alignment. And Andy can do that with like what about a little, and that little just kind of cracks it into shape. So we try to get back to in-person collaboration as much as possible, but, we work with what we have.
So what would be your process for that little in a virtual world? How do you achieve something like that?
Well, Andy and I I start with tequila. He starts with mezcal. But seriously, like what we do is we try to replicate what it's like in real life as much as possible. And sometimes, there's a hierarchy of needs and communication, and when I was a journalist, your number one thing was, I want to be in person, right? You want to see if the person you're talking to, who might be a CEO that's projecting confidence, but then if you see that his fingernails are like bitten to the quick, I mean, that doesn't mean that the company's going to go to hell, but it means that maybe he's got something going on that is like bothering him. The second thing is like, you can do a video call. And then of course there's the telephone call, and the last thing you want is email, because the broken telephone is real. So I'm trying to figure out, did I answer your question? Like, I think we just try to use whatever we have. And sometimes it means just getting in a car and me leaving New York and going down to Delaware. And especially if we're working on a film and we're working on things that, the creative process and the artistic process is one that requires, for me at least, I like a collaborator. I like an editor. I like somebody that's going to help me refine my ideas. And even working through this talk, some of the things that Andy was able to like mention on the phone just would tighten up, despite some of my technological issues, and my falling braces back here, it would really be helpful. And I think the problem with remote learning and remote communication is that it leaves you feeling like God has to get the hell off this computer, instead of like, the end of a really good meeting is when everything starts to come together. Whereas the end of a Zoom meeting, it's like you're looking at the clock and you're like, cool, I can go back to whatever, hanging out.
Okay, so there are a bunch of other questions, Mark, that are starting to flow in for you. So this one comes from Matt Bean, asking, are there any lost fonts that are still being searched for? And can you please host a Netflix series like American Pickers, but instead of diving into barns for antiques, you're hunting for old fonts and bringing them to life?
I'm still looking for the font that defined Hammurabi's code. I'm still looking for the font that was used on Moses's tablet. There's no shortage of fonts, and fonts that are lost are probably out there, and fonts that are found in and renewed. I mean, God, you look at the, even if you look at the Biden-Harris campaign that I believe Heffler did it, and it's just, it just feels fresh and it feels new and it feels like this. And I believe it's like it was based on his adaptation. I mean, it was based on his quest for or his obsession with clock faces and watches, right? And that was an episode in that adaptation Netflix series. I do think that a series on the different types of cultural forces that use fonts. If you think about the way Nike uses Just Do It, you think away, and Futura, you think away that Barbara Kruger uses Futura, and then you think about the way that, Supreme borrows Futura and Barbara Kruger to project itself. I think Bean's onto something, and I think we should definitely talk to Kevin and his team to make something happen.
Yeah, it's perfect. We've got Netflix here today as well. All right, so a few more questions. This one comes from Jamie and asking, when trying to dial into a brand and select a font to express it, do you more often present multiple disparate options or tighter, subtly different options?
So, this is always interesting, right? I remember when I worked at Fortune magazine, our photo editor was named Michelle McNally. And Michelle went on to be the photo editor of the New York Times. She's this amazing eye and amazing, she was amazing, I don't want to say manipulator, but she was really good at helping people come to a conclusion that might be closer to her own. And so in those days at Fortune, it was a classic portrait of a grip and grin white guy with like a red tie. And if you wanted to get crazy, you'd have him take off his suit jacket, right? So she would be able to put like one of those pictures down, and then she'd have the CEO like bungee jumping. And then she'd find one where, I don't know. I think one of my favorite examples of a great photo, and this isn't Fortune, but it's, there's a picture of Lance Mountain, the skateboarder, and he's in a swimming pool, but the pool is filled with water and he's holding his skateboard. And so she would find the business version of that, right? That's like, it's so interesting and so unique and such an interesting way of doing it. So when we're thinking about fonts and we're thinking about presenting fonts, you want to give a certain, a breadth of what the brand can be and what can do. I mean, I think you could see with that Fortnite example, right? It really, the Times New Roman wasn't right. The curls wasn't right. Comic Sans is like a great kind of a font to beat up all the time, even though I kind of like it every now and again. But, with the Fortnite, and obviously you've got designers too that are kind of squeezing things a little bit. So it's not that the font makes the design, it's the collaboration between the designer and the font that makes it original and makes it new and makes it kind of squeeze and kind of do these wonderful things that really do create an ownership. So I guess what I would say is that while you're looking at type, it's always good to reduce, this idea that information is entropy, right? Too much is too much. And so how you can reduce your selections. And if you're working with a foundry like House to help guide you through what that feeling you want to project is, we're really good at kind of reducing your choices, but also giving you choice. Maybe that's a long answer to your question, but I think that's the way we'd go about it.
So our next question comes from Andrea. She asks, what are your thoughts on so many brands creating sans serif fonts for the digital age? Do you foresee them losing their uniqueness because of this crowded space?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I feel like everything loses its uniqueness in this crowded space of the internet, right? Like everybody's a celebrity, everybody's a musician, everybody's an everything. And I don't really worry about stuff like that, right? Like, I don't think that there's a trend towards sans serif that's going to like ruin branding or ruin type or ruin faces. It really depends on, like, your brand has to have like character. Your brand has to have a purpose. Your brand has to want to do something that is like important to your audience or to your customer. And so, whether it's like all of a sudden a flood of sans serif type that's going to like ruin the world of advertising and design, I just can't think about things like that. I mean, it's a fine question, but it's not one I really can get into because to me, I don't know. I think sometimes, yeah, more can be a little overwhelming, but you just got to dig in and kind of think like what's going to look good and how's it going to look. And if you start worrying about trends, you're kind of screwed anyways. It's again about authenticity, character, and a little bit of attitude.
Right. Making your brand human.
Well, yeah,
so,
and humanity in digital is really important, and for sure.
So this next one comes from Matt, asking, can you speak to the way House uses glyphs? Is there another deeper communication besides just how cool they look?
Well, so, I mean, one of my favorite stories on glyphs is, it gets told in Helvetica, right, where David Carson took the, and I think I'm talking about the same thing. I sometimes confuse my terminology, but when there was a boring Brian Ferry interview, and so he decided to put it in dingbats, right? And so at least it looked cool. We just released a font called Municipal, right? And it's based on utility covers, manhole covers, sort of these things that you don't really notice until you look down and you realize that they're beautiful, and they have all kinds of in the way that that people used to make things, where there was craft and artisanship, right? And so while there's designs all over the manhole covers to keep you from like kind of falling on your backside, right? They also are designed and laid out in a way that's really beautiful. And so when we were producing that font family, and when I say we, Ken Barber was like the guru behind that whole concept, and we spent 5 years producing it, right? It's very complicated making a font. I'm not sure how many people have ever done it or thought about it, but it's like there's a lot of detail that goes into the letters and numbers and various different pieces and parts of it. But so as a complement to that font family, we created those visual assets that could accompany it, that were based on the manhole covering ornamentation. So the glyphs and the ornamentation definitely. It works on menus, it works on websites, it works on just giving a sense of kind of beauty and interest to, the numbers and the font themselves, and kind of helps you see how the style and the curvature and like the spacing of the letters can be reflected in something that's different than those alphabets.
Great. Next one, we have a bunch more, so we'll get through a couple more, and then Mark, I'll have a lot to share with you afterwards as well that you can follow up on directly. So next one is from Spencer, asking, what do you think the most important and powerful component is in visual branding?
Well, I mean, if you ask a brand manager or a CMO, it's like just make the logo bigger, right? But I mean, that's an old joke, right? But I think the thing about your visual identity is, so there's two different ways to think about this, right? So when Burton first started, they worked with this amazing company called JDK, and Michael Jagger is their executive creative director. And I wrote about them at Fast Company, and he was like somebody that I covered as a source, and he became a bit of a design mentor to me. And when he talked about the early stage of Burton and how they were looking to kind of create a mark for themselves, they started thinking about snowboarding as a sport, which was kind of becoming itself in its own way too. And so what they did was they allowed themselves to actually be a little looser in the way that they use typography and they use fonts. And so they didn't have a defined mark and a defined logo. But when they kind of discovered who they were able to build that Burton brand. And so it's a couple different answers here, right? So one is like figure out who you are. And if your brand and your audience and your style can handle it, have some fun with the font and have some fun with your expression. But then I think eventually you want to get to that kind of Patagonia level or that Nike level or that Apple level. It's so, you can almost get to the point where, McDonald's can remove the Kick-Donald's, right? And just be the arches of the M. You can remove the word Apple and just be that Macintosh. And so you want to think about the visual representation as an object and think about the visual representation of the letters. And then, if you can play with negative space and find some kind of bit of genius to put an arrow in there that shows that you're going to get stuff to the place where it belongs really quick, then that's great too. But, my advice is try to find a way to be clear and to have some style, but just don't get all Rococo unless your style is totally Rococo. But that's just me. I kind of like it when it's clean and to the point, and then it has one little thing that kind of catches your eye and makes you go like, oh, cool, that's really different. Work with House. We'll help you out.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about the different stages of where a brand is in its life cycle too, would
Yeah.
impact the answer to that question. All right, so this is a fun one for you. This comes from Luca. What is the custom type project that was the most fun to work on or that made you feel the most proud?
A custom project. I mean,
You got a lot of great stories.
there's a lot of great stories, and even some I can't talk about, but let me just go back to working at Fast Company, right, as an editor. And, you know, the headline was Typography Freaks, right? And, sometimes you tell the subject of your story, the headline, and they might not like it, right? They might think like, oh, House would be like, we're not freaks. I mean, of course, House has a freakiness, so it definitely has the capability to embrace it. But when we asked them to do a sort of behind the font video, they talked about the inspiration for, like, they started with freaky, right? And they started with thinking like, well, who's super freaky? And now I'm blanking on the name. Rick James, right? And they started thinking about the red boots, right, on that album cover. And so as Ken was writing it and as Andy was giving him the chiropractic adjustments, they realized that I think it was like the curvature of the T and the S was kind of meeting each other as it was in this beautiful red boot look. And then they turned the end of the T into like a tongue. And then when they had the tongue, they were debating like how big should the spit be on the tongue. And so to both like work with them on a custom typeface that was going to be used as like a spread for the magazine, that was going to be in our like, franchise of the Masters of Design issue. It was very cool because you're working with total pros that know exactly what they're doing. So my input, didn't need to be very strong at all. I was just like, it was just, there was a kinship and a mental kinship when we're working together. And House is always thinking about how can it be fun, right? And how can it serve a business purpose? And it's not like in that order. I think we start with the business purpose, and then we think about the fun and the style and putting art back into commercial art.
Yep, but the fun and the art is always a big part of it.
Well, it just makes it more interesting for us.
Absolutely. All right, so I think we have time maybe for one more question. There's an interesting one that came in from Arnaldo. In my experiences, the budgets rarely allow for a custom typeface. So I'm forced to adapt an existing typeface or never really get to do what my vision is. Do you have tips for a person who would love to do more custom type work for branding and how we can make our bosses see the value in the process of custom lettering or marks?
Yeah, I mean, budgets are always tough, right? And they get tougher all the time. I mean, we're living in a very strange economic cycle right now. And, one of the first things that gets cut are what are considered oftentimes in the C-suite or, even in the brand management side as like a luxury, the idea of creating a custom font versus just using some kind of free font. But again, I mean, I think when you think about, I think you should produce a body of work that kind of shows the impact of what your custom font is going to do for the brand, right? So, just going in and saying it looks cool is not going to work on a kind of bean counter, even in the marketing department, right? Because looking cool is one thing, but like getting those Tyrannosaurus arms to reach into their wallet, it's not that easy to do. So what you have to do is say like, oh, well, this kind of look of the typeface, maybe it can actually help explore a bigger idea of the industry that you're in, or it can shine a light on something that's a little more interesting, and maybe it can actually kind of evolve into a part of a marketing campaign, either for social media or for a LinkedIn or for any of the different like platforms that we have. So, my first piece of advice is like, don't ever go in to pitch a font as looking cool or being like beautiful. I mean, you can feel like the purpose of doing it is that it is beautiful and that it has like a kind of artistic purpose, but you want to make sure that it serves the business purpose. And that doesn't mean you're selling out, right? It just means that you're thinking about what the goals of the business are. And so you want them to make as much money as possible so that later when you do a product and you're saying like, oh, for this product, I think we should do a custom font, they can remember like, oh, right, you're doing everything you can to help visually arrest the attention of our customers, to make them remember our brand instead of the competitor's brand. And then you just kind of work them and you slowly get them to understand what type does to a person, how it makes you see something in a way that you can't unsee it. And again, that's not like the easiest answer. I mean, I wish I could say like, oh, all you gotta do is like put a couple X's together, a Y, and then you do some little jujitsu hypnotism, but it just doesn't work like that. You have to think about your customer, which is sometimes your boss, or sometimes the person that's making the decision. And you have to think about what their needs are and what they want. And then you have to take that typeface or that custom font and what it does and kind of show them how it's going to achieve their goals. And then they're going to be closer to being on your side.
Yep. And I would imagine a lot of it also starts with just educating on the role of typography in branding and the importance of that plays. And then almost at that point, you could get to then the role of a custom typeface.
Yeah, and I don't think you need to get into the sans serif, serif, ligature, all that kind of, you kind of want to say like, look at this brand and look at this brand and look at how they use these different fonts. And then you start to understand, like when you think about, a type of sport, a type of identity, a type of globalism, a type of art, a type of style, a type of fashion, when you think about the best brands, they all look really cool, and they look cool for a reason because they actually paid attention to how they're presenting themselves.
Yep, makes sense. All right, well, I think, Mark, we are up on time. I do want to say that we've gotten a few comments that people would watch your Netflix show, so.
Oh, cool. Yeah, cool. We'll start a Kickstarter.
But thank you so much for the great presentation, as well as answering so many questions. And yep, you can continue to take a look at the chat, and there's probably going to be some more coming in for you as well.
I mean, thanks for having me here in the mothership at Monotype. It was really good to be, here and see what it's like, and to be on the panel, or to be on this, to be at this brand talks with just such great people. It's a real thrill and an honor. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Mark.